What's up? Welcome back. I'm Phil. That's Sam.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel.
Today we're doing Russia's top nuke targets.
It's a little scary.
A little scary. A little scary, Sam says. However, it is better to be informed than not.
It is. That is true.
So we're going to know where Russia's going to target, potentially. And we've learned a lot on the channel as it is, right, with military-based content?
Oh, so much. Anything from, the equipment that they have access to from different countries, their military spending budget.
The laser warfare that we had no idea about.
Yeah, like also some really prominent figures in, military history and their stories. So it's been really cool.
Yeah, so we plan to do more in the future. So if you want to hang around and subscribe, we'd love to have you. All right, let's get into Russia's top nuke targets.
Let's say things with Russia turn into the worst case scenario.
Hopefully not.
A deranged, desperate Vladimir Putin sees his regime about to collapse. In a last-ditch effort to take as many enemies with him as possible, he orders a massive launch of Russia's nuclear arsenal, targeting the West.
No thank you.
As the silos open, hundreds or thousands of intercontinental ballistic missiles armed with nuclear warheads streak away at speeds of 15,000 miles per hour. But where are they headed? Thankfully, this hypothetical remains very, very unlikely. Unfortunately, it's also not entirely impossible. Russia has the world's largest nuclear stockpile, with nearly 6,000 weapons and roughly 1,600 actively deployed warheads.
Insane.
The question of where these might strike if fired is one that experts and policymakers have worried about since the days of the Cold War. Now, with nuclear threats once rising again, it's worth looking at how such a doomsday scenario might play out. In this video, we'll take a look at the places Russia might target with a nuclear barrage, starting in the United States. Some of the first US targets for a Russian nuclear strike are the major centers of power you would expect. The Pentagon is among the most important of these, as it acts as the headquarters for the US Department of Defense. If Russia were able to damage or destroy the Pentagon, it would be an enormous blow to the command structure of the US military. It would likely not cripple the US armed forces, but would cause a major disruption and make it far more difficult for the US to organize a response. Because of the size of the nuclear blast and its fallout, a strike on the Pentagon would also likely destroy much of Washington, D.C. Some 713,000 people live in D.C., while more than 6.3 million live in the greater D.C. area. Estimates for a nuclear strike on the Pentagon indicate that close to 500,000 people could be killed instantly, with many more falling sick from radioactive fallout afterwards. The initial blast would vaporize the Pentagon itself and anything else within a half-mile radius. Damage from the strike would radiate outwards some 4 miles from the epicenter, including the area containing the US Capitol building, White House, and Supreme Court. While the nuclear fireball and the enormous shockwave following it would be deadly on their own, it is the potential for widespread radiation which would create the biggest hazard. Radiation anywhere near the blast would be intense enough to cause third-degree burns, while also causing many harmful mutations in victims' DNA, leading to cellular degeneration and cancer. Even if people in the larger blast radius managed to survive the explosion, there's a good chance they would die from the huge amount of radiation exposure. The White House is roughly 2.17 miles from the Pentagon, putting it well within the damage zone of a nuclear blast. If the president were there, they would likely be killed by the force of the shockwave, even if the White House and Capitol were not targeted independently. Thousands of US officials and workers would certainly be killed, sending the government into crisis mode. The president would declare a state of emergency and likely invoke martial law. If the president were killed, the next in the line of succession would be the vice president, Speaker of the House of Representatives, President pro tempore of the Senate, Secretary of State, and so on, until someone alive could be reached. Besides the institutions around Washington, D.C., the second major goal of a Russian nuclear attack would be to strike as many US missile silos as possible in order to minimize a retaliatory.
So just a few quick thoughts on that. Number one, I didn't realize that the Pentagon was so close to the White House. I don't know why, but I just thought they were in separate areas. It kind of seems like it's a strategic weakness, although you have missile defense systems, I'm sure, as well. But it kind of does seem like a little bit of a weakness that they are so close together. And
well, I was just about to say, like, all of those people they listed as, the runners-up to take the president's
they're
spot.
probably
They'd
in
probably
that area,
all be
in that vicinity. Well, what was that show that we watched some before?
Oh,
was basically everybody died in a blast, and
It was like a bomb that went off.
there was this guy that a
designated survivor.
Of course, he would remember at the exact same time, right? Anyways, designated survivor. That kind of is what we're referring to, right?
Yeah.
The other thing I was just going to mention is, though, it would make sense that you would target then the Pentagon, because everything is in that vicinity, right? If you were an enemy, that's...
But the thing with designated survivor was that it was just like one building that got taken down, right? Usually, like if all that entire radius is being taken out, it's like your designated survivor is probably in there.
Yeah, agreed. I was just saying, though, from a standpoint of an enemy, like it would make sense for you to target the Pentagon. They started with the Pentagon here first, and it makes sense that they started there first because that's probably where the enemy would target first. But the other side of that is like, how, I don't know if they're going to touch on it here, but are they going to be able to get to that point? Well, probably not, because the missile defense system is going to stop it before it reaches that point, right?
Tory strike. There is almost no chance this would be totally effective, as the US has nearly as many nuclear weapons as Russia, in addition to advanced early warning systems, nuclear submarines hidden around the world, and powerful air defense systems. But Russia would certainly try to take out as many silos as possible, especially those bases with Minuteman III ICBMs, which would mean targeting some very remote parts of the US. One of these is Malmstrom Air Force Base, located deep in the state of Montana. There are around 3,400 military personnel and 1,000 civilians working at Malmstrom, many responsible for the 150 Minuteman III nuclear missiles housed at the base. If a Russian nuclear weapon were able to strike Malmstrom, it would likely kill everyone at the base, plus nearly 15,000 people in the nearby towns of Black Eagle and Great Falls. The number of injured would be nearly double, even though the area is very sparsely populated. But high casualties would not be the goal of a strike on Malmstrom, as Russia would only be trying to cripple the ability of ICBMs to be fired from the base. The effects of a nuclear strike on the local environment would be devastating. Water flowing through the Mississippi River near the impact site would instantly vaporize, while the flow from upstream would eventually pass through the irradiated area around Malmstrom. The river would carry radioactive particles downstream, potentially all the way down its length.
Big
it
river.
would take months or years for any water drawn from nearby sources to be drinkable. In the meantime, large amounts of animals could die of radiation poisoning, even those hundreds of miles away. The ecological effect of such a shock would be felt across the country, and Malmstrom is far from the only target in a potential nuclear attack by Russia. Another key base likely to be targeted by Russia is Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. The base contains roughly another 150 Minuteman III missiles and a staff of 3,200 military personnel and 420 civilians. However, the town of Minot is also more populous, with nearly 50,000 people. There would likely be over 23,000 immediate casualties, with another 20,000 suffering from injuries and radiation sickness. Like Malmstrom, any strike on Minot AFB would also cause huge environmental damage, with radioactive fallout contaminating groundwater, soil, and air. The final ICBM silo which Russia would likely attempt to first strike on would be Francis E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. The ICBMs there would be a harder target since they are actually spread around in silos between Nebraska, Wyoming, and Colorado. The base has roughly similar numbers of staff and missiles to Malmstrom and Minot, and casualties from a strike would exceed 25,000. Cheyenne, Wyoming would also be devastated, and anyone present would receive a high dose of radiation. In addition to the major silos, a Russian nuclear attack would also target command and control centers across the country. Many of these are similarly hidden in rural locations around the US, often in plain sight. One major target would be the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD headquarters at Peterson Air Base in Colorado. NORAD is a joint organization made up of US and Canadian service members and civilians, responsible for aerospace protection of North America. Unfortunately, Peterson Base has over 8,700 active duty personnel, 1,300 reservists, 1,900 civilian staff, 10,000 family members, and over 20,000 veterans.
Wow.
The base also sits just outside the city of Colorado Springs, which has a population of nearly 500,000. A nuclear strike in this area would probably kill more than 60,000 people outright, and injure or irradiate another 200,000. Contamination of the water, air, and soil would again render much of the area uninhabitable, while winds could carry it into Kansas and other neighboring states. Another major target is Offutt Air Force Base, just outside of Omaha, Nebraska. Offutt is the headquarters of the US Strategic Command, or STRATCOM, responsible for strategic nuclear deterrence, global strike, and operating the Defense Department's global information grid. STRATCOM is critical to the operation of the larger US military. If a nuclear warhead struck Offutt Air Force Base, it could kill more than 40,000 and injure nearly 150,000. It would also seriously degrade the US ability to coordinate a military response and potentially create confusion within the command structure of the armed forces. Similarly, the nearby city of Omaha would be largely destroyed, potentially killing hundreds of thousands. The Missouri River would also be contaminated, leading to the deaths of wildlife and a drop in biodiversity. In the event that STRATCOM was hit with a nuclear strike, its command would be transferred to one of the other 10 command and control centers around the country. The new command would oversee preparations for a retaliatory nuclear strike, which could happen almost instantly, since Russia would be hard-pressed to cripple the US nuclear triad. Yet another potential target for Russian nukes would be the VLF, or Very Low Frequency Transmitter.
We finally moved out towards the coast here, and I just found it interesting that a lot of these locations that he's referred to thus far have been, in the interior
More
of
inland.
the U.S. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. Strategically, I don't know if they did that on purpose. You're out
Also,
more.
because if you have somebody attack you like by sea, right, as well, you want it to be more inland so people can't come from the coast.
Exactly, yeah, because, you could have a submarine just parked outside and boom, it takes 2 seconds and it's done, right?
Yeah.
But it takes a long time for it to travel across land and to that specific point, right? So I just found that an interesting point, and I don't know. You guys can add maybe some thoughts down below in the comments about whether they purposely put it there or it just happened by chance that that's the way it worked out. But I would imagine from a strategic standpoint, they wouldn't build them on the coast. Although we're getting into Maine here, which is in fact on the coast.
Yeah.
In Cutler, Maine. This station transmits one-way communications to submarines in the US Navy's Atlantic Fleet, allowing them to carry out strikes if necessary. Cutler transmits its messages at 24 kHz and only uses 1.8 megawatts of power, a relatively low data rate. It is Cutler Base which sends launch codes to US Ohio-class nuclear submarines in the Atlantic, which form the most difficult leg of the nuclear triad for any enemy to deal with. By destroying Cutler, Russia could theoretically cut off US contact with the subs and make a retaliatory strike harder. While immediate loss of life from a strike on Cutler would be under 1,000, its position on the Atlantic coast means that ocean life and coastal ecosystems would take most of the damage. There is also Cutler's counterpart in Washington, the Jim Creek Naval Radio Station, which transmits to the Pacific Fleet. It also sits in a remote area with few potential casualties, but again, air and water contamination from radiation could reach both Seattle and Vancouver, potentially making life in both cities hazardous. The blast would also create huge forest fires in Washington, which could burn for weeks on end, creating even more hazardous air conditions.
That would be a
Russia would
nightmare.
also target bases on
Nuclear
Hawaii,
forest fires.
which sits roughly 2,000 miles from the US mainland. On the island of Oahu is
Middle of
another
nowhere.
VLF transmitter, which can relay orders to the Pacific submarine fleet if the Jim Creek installation is damaged or destroyed. The Lualua transmitter unfortunately also makes Hawaii a prime target, as it provides redundancy for fleet communications. A Russian ICBM strike on Oahu would also be extremely deadly, as it is the most populated Hawaiian island, with over 1 million people at any given time. Due to its isolation and contained ecology, a nuclear strike on Oahu could make almost the entire island uninhabitable. There are also very few places for people to hide from such an attack, so anyone on the island would either die quickly or be in serious trouble. Since Hawaii also plays host to multiple US naval bases such as Pearl Harbor, there is also a good chance that the state would be hit with multiple missiles, leaving no places for easy evacuation. Every one of these is a strategic military installation, but even just nuclear strikes on these positions would kill many hundreds of thousands of Americans. The effect of a nuclear attack on multiple US cities would be far, far deadlier. If Putin truly opted for nuclear war, there is no reason to think he would do it halfway, and hitting the US's major cities would also destroy their economic capacity. In a first-strike nuclear scenario, each side would try to devastate the other beyond recovery, and that means the widespread targeting of civilians. Such an attack could easily be the deadliest in human history, far exceeding the only past uses of nuclear weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Outside of Washington, D.C., New York is the most obvious civilian target. It is both the financial capital of the United States and its largest city, as well as a global symbol of American power. It goes without saying that a nuclear explosion in Manhattan would be beyond devastating. The island is only 13.4 miles long, but it is one of the most densely populated areas in the entire country. An 800 kiloton nuclear warhead would instantly kill between 1.5 and 2 million people, with another 3 to 5 million seriously injured from radiation, burns, or collapsed buildings.
That's crazy.
The 5 boroughs of New York City collectively have almost 8.5 million, and every single one would have their lives upended. Even for those who avoid the initial blast or fireball, the shockwave's 500-mile-per-hour winds could prove fatal. As researchers recently wrote in New York Magazine, it would demolish the flimsiest buildings and strip the walls and roofs off stronger structures, leaving only their naked and warped scaffolding. It would snap utility poles like toothpicks and rip through trees, fling people through the air, and turn brick, glass, wood, and metal into deadly projectiles. A blast into
That's insane.
Yeah, it's insane the power of these weapons, and we really have no understanding or comprehension of them because we've never seen them. It's like one of those things where the only ones that were used happened so long ago, so we kind of forget about how brutal they can be. And obviously there's way more of them now, and probably way stronger. In fact, I think that's for sure a fact, is that they're way stronger. So you see this, right, when they talk about New York, right? The devastation that could happen in such a highly dense populated area. It, would just be catastrophic. And that's why, now the time frame that we're in, where these nuclear talks about weapons and stuff, and people kind of talk about it nonchalantly, I just don't get it. I'm like, I still, I'm like, how can you guys talk about this scenario that just like, it's like, well, if this happens, we'll just nuke them. It's to me,
Yeah.
I'm just like, no, you guys have no idea what you're talking about. You're talking about like nuking like a million
Yeah.
people in a split second, and then the after effects of the wind that they talked about, and forest
Don't
fires.
understand the
and-
magnitude of what that looks like. Yeah.
yeah, so it's a big wake up call, I think, that we're in 2025 and we're discussing these things, and even the fact that they're making a video. Obviously, some of it's fear-based propaganda, but Russia's top nuke targets shouldn't even be a conversation, really, because nobody wins, as they're alluding to, right? As soon as one person or one country
It
lets them go,
starts,
the
it's
other
a-
ones go, and it's like
Yeah.
the outcome is just disaster for
It's like
everybody.
once you take the lid off the box, you can't really put it back on.
Yeah. And anyways, hopefully we never get to this point, but it is really eye-opening when you start to see the population centers and the targets and what could happen if we ever got to that point.
Times Square, combined with the fireball, would carve a crater 50 feet deep at the center of the explosion.
Wow.
The shockwave would reach a diameter of nearly 3.2 miles, shattering windows as far as Gramercy Park and the American Museum of Natural History. The city's medical infrastructure would strain or collapse under the burden, especially with many major hospitals destroyed. Similarly, evacuation from Manhattan and other boroughs would be extremely difficult due to the destroyed buildings, collapsed tunnels and bridges, and press of people trying to escape. Nuclear blasts also release a strong electromagnetic pulse, which would knock out vital systems across the city, including electronic communication, medical technology, and the power grid itself. This would make any emergency response vastly more difficult and lead to even greater casualties. Yet in the event of a real nuclear war, Russia wouldn't stop there. Los Angeles is another obvious target. As the country's second-largest city and a major source of American wealth and cultural power, LA is not as densely populated as New York City, with some 4 million inhabitants and sprawling, low-rise housing. But at this point, we probably don't need to tell you that a nuclear blast in downtown LA would also be apocalyptic. 500,000 to 700,000 could die instantly, with 1.5 million more injured. LA also has roughly 5.5 million cars and little public transportation. Because of this, major roads even well outside the blast zone would be almost impossible to use as people flee from the radioactive fallout. LA's chronic drought would also be made far worse, potentially leaving millions without safe drinking water. In the middle of the
Wow.
country, Chicago and its nearly 3 million residents would also likely be targeted. A nuclear blast here could kill 500,000 to 600,000 instantly and badly injure over 1 million, while a large portion of the blast would explode into Lake Michigan, with winds spreading the fallout north, south, and east. The heavy populated Great Lakes region would be at risk and probably need to be evacuated as well. To have
Toronto.
any chance in a nuclear war, Putin would need to go all out before the West could overwhelm Russia's limited defenses. Because of the effects of wind, even a small percentage of the nuclear weapons in Russia's arsenal could spread fallout across much of the United States and make many areas completely uninhabitable. Being far away from the actual impact sites still might not be a guarantee of safety, especially in more densely populated parts of the country. Since 80% of Americans live east of the Mississippi River, any nuclear strike on the eastern seaboard would be especially deadly. Overall, estimates suggest that the total number killed, injured, or exposed to radiation in a full Russian nuclear attack could exceed 256 million.
Wow.
That's 3/4 of the population
Insane.
just in the United States. But an attack on the US would also leave Russia open to retaliation from other NATO countries, meaning that they too would almost certainly be targeted early in a nuclear conflict. This would mean major European military installations like Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany, which coordinates NATO's
Ramstein.
air and missile defense networks. Spotters at Ramstein would be among the first to know if a country like Russia actually launched nuclear ICBMs, but due to its relative geographic proximity, there will be little time for a possible evacuation. A nuclear blast over Ramstein would kill some 30,000 people, while winds could potentially carry fallout across the continent. Assuming a retaliatory strike didn't just wipe Moscow off the map, this also makes European targets riskier for Putin in the event of a nuclear attack, since at least some fallout could make it all the way back to the Kremlin. Other military targets in Europe which might be targeted include NATO's Supreme Allied Command in Belgium, as well as other US bases in Europe, like Caserma Ederle in Italy, which hosts the US's powerful 173rd Airborne Brigade. Strategically or economically important cities in Europe are also potential targets. This includes London, the most populous city in Western Europe, with over 8.8 million people.
Wow.
The UK also has roughly 200 nuclear weapons of its own, which also might make it a high-risk target. Similarly to New York City, a nuclear explosion over London could instantly kill over 1 million, while total casualties from the shockwave and radiation could be over 2.3 million. London is also the capital of the UK, meaning that its government would also likely perish in the blast. As with other cities, London's vital infrastructure would also be completely devastated, making any emergency response very difficult. And coastal winds coming off the Atlantic could carry the radiation north into Scotland and west into France and other parts of continental Europe. Long story short, anywhere in the world getting hit with a modern nuclear weapon would be a horrifying scenario. While this hypothetical is obviously incredibly unlikely to happen, it's also pretty obvious that if it did, there would be basically no good options. Because of the concept of mutually assured destruction, which has
Exactly
kept
what I was
nuclear
thinking.
war at bay since the 1950s, governments like the US are ridiculously unprepared to deal with the consequences if it did happen. As the article in New York Magazine recently put it, more than 70 years ago, America became the first and only country to use nuclear weapons in war. Despite witnessing the immediate and enduring horror of those attacks, despite decades of technological advances in nuclear warfare, the US remains shockingly unprepared for a similar assault on its own soil. Much of the short-term response to a nuclear explosion in a city like New York would be improvised, adapted from plans meant for other kinds of disasters. Putin knows that firing even a single nuclear weapon would likely mean the end of him and possibly much of Russia. But the fact remains that nukes are out there and could theoretically be used at any time in the future. In an increasingly uncertain world, it wouldn't hurt governments around the world to step up their nuclear preparations, because the fact is, it's impossible to know the future. But what do you think? What would the targets for a Russian nuclear attack be? And just how unprepared is the world for that small possibility? Let us know what you think in the comments below.
Like this-
Ill-prepared. How are you supposed to prepare for nuclear war? Everything is going to be gone. Like,
Yeah, I think it's,
unless you're building like giant silos in the ground.
well, when they say that, that's it, right? It's like, going underground is basically your best option. The second best option is having a defense system that can, I don't know, like some, sci-fi based dome that you can put around your entire country or major important cities that pops up in defense of that. And
Like the dome they have in Black Panther.
yeah,
It's like,
basically. Yeah. But, because they have laser weapons, right? So if you have a laser defense system of sorts, then that might be able to shield you to an extent. But, because we see, it sounds crazy, but like we're talking about Star Wars when you talk about lasers, right? And there are shields in that kind of warfare, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, for sure.
I don't think we're that far off
This
from
is making me
something of
think of
that
that
nature.
TV show we just watched though, the Silo one, where
Yeah.
they all moved like underground and built the whole world underground.
Yeah, but like they said, it's mutually assured destruction when they're talking
Oh
about
yeah.
this. I think if there was going to be a nuclear attack, my personal opinion is that we wouldn't see something like this. We would see something like Russia sends it to, North Korea or another country, and then they set it off, and but nobody knows it was Russia type thing.
Mhm.
It would be like, because that would be the only way you would avoid an all-out nuclear war, would
Mhm.
be that if it came from some place that, once US got hit, right, they got hit by one or two, right, we'll say, and then they're trying to figure out who it was, right, because it came from out of nowhere, right, it was launched from a sub or something like that. And then it's, oh, it was North Korea or whatever, and they don't have any more nukes, or they're limited in their nukes, right? Rather than Russia just, sending them out from Russia itself, and
Yeah.
then it being all out war back and forth and everybody's annihilated. I think it's probably going to be like a one-off situation
They're
where,
trying to be sneaky about it.
right, yeah, a covert attack basically. So, and
True.
nobody claims it, right? And yeah, hopefully that never happens. It's scary. And, I hope, like I said, that we get to a point where we can nullify nukes by a defense system so that because that's the only way you're going to get by this, right? In the future is like just either nobody uses them, which you're leaving up to chance, or you come up with a defense system that says, no, they can't be used. They're useless. And that's because we have the defense system for it, right?
Yeah.
So,
Well, hopefully one day, like you said, you don't know how far technology is going to advance.
yeah. Anyways, guys, let us know your thoughts down below. Let us know other recommendations for military-based content. Have a great day. We'll see you soon.
Thanks for watching.